Imagine waking up one morning not to the blare of sirens nor the roar of protest, but to the sound of sweeping. In the markets, the schools, even outside the hospitals, thousands of people were brushing dust from the earth with nothing but old brooms and a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't a protest, it wasn't a government program, and it wasn't driven by foreign money or flashy media campaigns. It was something far rarer, a quiet revolution started by ordinary people who believed their dignity was worth fighting for, not with weapons, but with wheelbarrows and their own hands. In September 2023, in the landlocked nation of Burkina Faso, over 30,000 citizens, from farmers to teachers, from students to soldiers, put down their routines and picked up tools. Their goal wasn't political change, it was something deeper: to clean their streets, schools, clinics, and communities, and in doing so to reclaim ownership of their country's future. What sparked it all? A single message from a young president, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, who stood before his people and said, "This land is ours. No one will clean it for us." It was simple, it was human, and it struck like lightning. Now let me ask you, in your own community, when was the last time something changed? Not because it was funded, but because people believed, can a nation rise on nothing but purpose and pride? If these questions resonate with you, if you've ever seen your own neighborhood come alive with hope, then this story is for you. Please like this video if it touches your heart, share it with someone who still believes in the power of ordinary people, and subscribe if you know the world needs more stories like this, because sometimes the strongest revolutions begin not with speeches, but with a broom. It began not with a policy, nor with a budget, but with a sentence. Standing in front of a modest podium in the capital city of Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, clad not in a suit but in his well-worn military fatigues, looked directly into the camera and said, "Burkina Faso is our home, and no one cleans your home for you." The broadcast was brief, less than 2 minutes, but across the country, across dirt roads, radios in kitchens, loudspeakers in markets, it struck like a spark in dry grass. Within hours, WhatsApp groups buzzed with neighbors making plans. Mosques, churches, and village elders spread the word. Teachers rewrote lesson plans. Soldiers folded their uniforms and stepped into the streets with rakes. By the following morning, a country often spoken of only in the context of conflict or poverty was moving together. This was not a campaign directed by bureaucrats. There were no trucks loaded with government supplies, no signs with donor logos, no foreign consultants overseeing progress. Instead, there were brooms, thousands of them, clutched by farmers, vendors, school children, mothers, and market women. In Bobo Dioulasso, women who spent their lives selling vegetables lined the market stalls with cloth and swept every aisle. In Kaya, students marched from their classrooms to the playground with trash bags in hand. In the northern villages near Djibo, elders with gray beards and bent backs worked shoulder to shoulder with teenagers, some of whom had never known a time of peace or order. There was no script, no manual. And yet across all 13 regions of Burkina Faso, the choreography was the same: sweeping, scrubbing, restoring. For 7 days straight, the sounds of national life shifted, no longer dominated by car horns, political rallies, or the background hum of hardship. The streets pulsed with the rhythm of restoration, the swish of a broom, the scrape of a shovel, the laughter of people doing something worthwhile. Dusty roads once lined with trash became walkable again. Drainage ditches long clogged with plastic and rot flowed freely. Mosquito breeding grounds were cleared. Community health workers reported fewer diarrhea cases by the second day. By week's end, several hospitals reported a 30% drop in sanitation-related admissions. But more than what was removed, trash, disease, decay, was what was revealed to the people themselves. In the central town of Koudougou, a group of young boys who usually hawked biscuits at the bus station spent 3 days cleaning the main health center. When asked why, one of them replied, "Because my little brother was born here. I want it to be clean for the next baby." In the south, in a village called Tenkodogo, a woman named Fanta, mother of 6, organized over 40 women to clean the primary school her children attend. When the headmaster thanked her, she responded, "You don't thank someone for washing their own clothes." These moments, unfilmed, uncelebrated, became the invisible spine of a national movement. And then came the president himself. On day 4, in the city of Ouagadougou, a grainy video surfaced online. It showed Captain Ibrahim Traoré gloveless, sweating, and knee-deep in a ditch, pulling debris from a gutter beside a group of university students. He wasn't posing for a photo. He wasn't giving a speech. He was working. That image ricocheted across the country, not through press releases, but through text messages, word of mouth, and radios. For a nation weary of promises and leaders kept behind motorcades, this simple act shattered cynicism. By day 5, the movement had become something far bigger than a cleanup effort. It was a reclamation of pride. Even in regions battling insecurity where government presence had long since faded, locals organized their own cleanup teams. Some carried both brooms and rifles, one for sweeping, one for protection. The symbolism was unmistakable. Even in conflict zones, people were choosing life over despair, dignity over defeat. The government, for its part, stepped back. It didn't orchestrate. It didn't co-opt. It simply watched, sometimes in awe, as an entire country remembered that change doesn't need permission. There were no medals handed out, no bonuses given, but there was singing. In the evening light of the final day, from Nona to Gawa, people gathered in cleared town squares. Drums beat, children danced, elders prayed, and a single phrase kept repeating on lips, young and old: nous avons fait ça nous-mêmes. We did this ourselves. In a nation often forced to look outward for validation or support, those 5 words felt like the start of something new. The 5th day of Burkina Faso's sanitation revolution didn't begin like the others. In a windswept village outside Fada, a small boy named Madu rose before the sun. He had no gloves, no boots, only a makeshift broom crafted from palm fronds and twine. But he showed up at the village square with his older sister and neighbors, ready to sweep. He was 7 years old. That same morning in Ouagadougou market, women arrived hours early, not to sell, but to scrub the stalls. They sang as they worked, not in protest, but in pride. Songs that hadn't been heard in generations, about clean rivers, about honoring the ancestors, about the dignity of labor, rose over the city like incense. It wasn't just a cleanup anymore. It was a spiritual crescendo, the emotional peak of a nation rediscovering itself. In the north, an imam and a pastor walked side by side into a clinic, neither to preach, but to disinfect waiting room benches. In the west, a former rebel commander who had once taken up arms now took up a rake, saying, "This is the first battle worth fighting that doesn't require blood." Everywhere, the symbolic and the real collided. Children in schools wrote essays about their favorite cleaning moment. Teachers stopped mid-lesson to walk their students outside and pick up trash. Entire neighborhoods formed human chains to remove garbage from ravines. People stopped seeing the trash as someone else's problem. They saw it as theirs, and they took it personally. As the week reached its peak, so too did its visibility. Burkina Faso diaspora around the world, watching videos on social media from Paris, Montreal, and Atlanta, began organizing remote cleanups in solidarity. In Ghana, young activists traveled across the border to join the movement. One student from Tamale said on camera, "We came not to help, but to learn." Regional officials from Mali and Niger made unannounced visits to observe. They returned home with reports stunned by the cohesion, the joy, and the discipline they had witnessed. A Nigerian delegate remarked, "They didn't need a ministry to mobilize, they had something stronger: purpose." Meanwhile, the media began to shift. What started as a local story covered mostly by Burkina Faso radio stations was soon picked up by African satellite channels. Then came articles from Jeune Afrique, then Le Monde, then Deutsche Welle. One British columnist wrote, "While the West debates climate strategies in boardrooms, Burkina Faso is out there with brooms doing the work." Even health experts weighed in. The World Health Organization quietly released a bulletin noting significant public health improvements tied to the movement. Some officials compared it to Rwanda's Umuganda Day, but noted that Burkina Faso's effort emerged organically without government mandates. What made this moment historic wasn't just its success, it was that it shattered long-held assumptions that poor nations must wait for foreign funding, that leadership must come top-down, that civic pride is dead in the face of struggle. The proof was now undeniable, and it wasn't written in white papers or reports. It was written in the hands of tens of thousands of citizens whose clothes were stained with dust and sweat, but whose spirits had never been cleaner. And then came the defining moment, one that would etch this revolution into national memory. At the close of Day 6, President Traoré appeared unannounced in the neighborhood of Tampuy, not to speak, not to supervise, but to clean. He arrived with no press, no fanfare. Word only spread when children recognized him and began shouting, "Le président est là. Il travaille avec nous." The president is here. He's working with us. He joined a group of women scrubbing the pavement outside a community clinic. When one of them offered her broom, he accepted. He swept silently for over an hour. No camera crew followed him. Only the people. Photos taken on cell phones later flooded social media, but they weren't polished or curated. They showed a leader not behind a podium, but on the ground shoulder to shoulder with his citizens. That night, radio hosts across the country recounted the moment in disbelief. Callers phoned in with tears recounting what they had seen with their own eyes. One elderly man simply said, "Ibrahim Traoré has done what no president has done before. He got his hands dirty for us." This was the emotional peak, the turning point where skepticism gave way to belief. When those who had doubted now joined. When those who felt forgotten now felt seen. When leadership was no longer a title, it was an act of service. When the last broom was set down and the dust began to settle, what remained was far more than clean streets. Something had shifted deeply and irreversibly within the heart of the Burkina Faso people. In the days following the sanitation week, hospitals across the country began reporting numbers that stunned even veteran doctors. Cases of diarrhea, cholera, and skin infections, common in areas with poor sanitation, dropped by over 40% in some regions. Clinics that had been overwhelmed by preventable diseases were suddenly breathing easier. For nurses like Awa in the dusty town of Po, it wasn't just the statistics that mattered, it was the smell. For the first time in years, she said the clinic no longer smells of rot. It smells clean. But public health was only the beginning. In schools, teachers noted an unexpected behavioral shift. Students who had helped clean their classrooms and playgrounds began to care more deeply about their learning environment. Discipline improved. Attendance rose. A teacher in Tenkodogo remarked, "They began arriving early not to play, but to tidy up." These weren't isolated cases. Across the country, something invisible but potent was spreading a sense of ownership. In local markets, vendors formed informal clean teams to maintain their stalls. Communities began scheduling weekly mini cleanups without waiting for government instructions. Some villages even created clean zones where littering became socially unacceptable, not because of law, but because of pride. This was civic consciousness, reborn, not taught in textbooks, but lived on dusty streets. And yet the most powerful transformation wasn't physical, it was psychological. A nation long labeled as impoverished or fragile was now looking in the mirror and seeing something else: capable, resilient, sovereign. For decades, Burkina Faso had been at the mercy of headlines written elsewhere about terrorism, coups, and poverty. But this movement rewrote the narrative, not by erasing hardship, but by proving that identity could be built not on aid, but on action. President Ibrahim Traoré, recognizing the movement's significance, didn't let it fade into memory. On national radio, he addressed the people with words that would soon be etched into classrooms and public buildings. "We are not a nation waiting to be rescued. We are the hands that build, the hearts that carry, and the will that refuses to give up." And then he made it law. A presidential decree established National Unity Day, held monthly on the first Saturday, dedicated to community cleanup and civic service. It wasn't compulsory. There were no penalties. But it became ritual, like church, like market day. Each month, thousands still gather, not because they have to, but because they want to. In some places, the cleanup day has evolved into something more: a community celebration. People wear matching shirts, sing songs, hold small parades. Schools reward the cleanest neighborhoods. Local musicians write jingles about hygiene and honor. A national cleanup became a cultural reset. But with every grassroots shift comes political consequences. For the government, the sanitation revolution was a test and a surprise. Ministries that had once waited for foreign funding to build public toilets or waste systems were now being pressured by citizens who had taken matters into their own hands. Local mayors, many of whom were skeptical, now found themselves being held to new standards. In Ouahigouya, the mayor's office received dozens of letters from citizens demanding consistent waste collection. One letter read, "If we can do it with our hands, you can do it with your office." Accountability, long absent from local politics, was making a comeback, not through protests or politics, but through public example. And internationally, the shift was impossible to ignore. While some Western media framed it as a feel-good story, others were more honest. In think tanks from Washington to Brussels, analysts quietly began to ask if Burkina Faso can mobilize 30,000 citizens without a cent of foreign funding. What else can they do? For nations built on the model of dependency, the sanitation revolution was a quiet threat. It suggested that the people of Africa may no longer wait. That sovereignty is not just about borders, it's about belief. Some diplomats privately admitted Burkina Faso had done more for its image with 1 week of brooms than with decades of aid reports. It had shown that dignity isn't imported, it's reclaimed. And perhaps most profoundly, it redefined leadership. In a world where many presidents seek control, Traoré had done something different. He had shared ownership. He led by walking by, sweeping by, showing up. And in return, his people followed, not out of fear, but out of recognition. That's rare. That's powerful. And that may be the true legacy of the sanitation revolution. At first, the world barely noticed. After all, Burkina Faso rarely makes headlines in Washington or Brussels. For many in the West, it's a name that gets confused with Burundi, a place somewhere over there where crisis and conflict blend into background noise. But something about this movement, simple, sincere, and unprompted, cut through the static. When cell phone videos began circulating online showing women scrubbing market floors, children hauling garbage from village roads, and even the president himself sweeping gutters with the people, curiosity turned to awe. In France, where Burkinabe immigrants often struggle for visibility, diaspora communities burst with pride. Some organized community cleanups in Parisian suburbs, flying flags and singing folk songs from home. One Burkinabe nurse in Marseille told the Le Monde, "For once we are not victims on screen, we are the example." In the United States, small African diaspora groups in places like Minneapolis, Houston, and the Bronx began sharing footage under the hashtag #BurkinaRising. African American community organizers drew parallels to the civil rights era where ordinary people took action not for cameras, but for community. And in international development circles, the movement triggered something rare: self-reflection. At the United Nations, a working paper quietly circulated describing the Burkinabe cleanup as a model for high-impact, low-cost civic mobilization. It noted, no aid required, no foreign consultants, no conditionalities, just national will. At the World Bank, analysts, who typically rely on metrics like GDP growth and infrastructure spending, began asking new questions. How do you measure pride? How do you calculate the value of dignity? What is the cost of waiting for others to fix what you can fix yourself? Even American political analysts, long focused on security threats in the Sahel, took notice. One column in Foreign Policy dared to ask, is Burkina Faso quietly building the strongest civic culture in West Africa, one broom at a time? But perhaps most telling was the silence from those who benefit from a passive Africa. No major Western leader issued a statement. There was no G7 tweet, no USAID press release. Because this wasn't a success they could claim. It wasn't funded by them. It didn't fit the narrative of Africa in need. Instead, it fit a different narrative, one that is gaining ground across the global South, that sovereignty isn't declared, it's demonstrated. That a people united around dignity is more powerful than any summit, loan, or treaty. To Americans watching from afar, especially older generations who remember when civic duty meant something tangible, the images from Burkina Faso may feel like a memory of town cleanups, of neighborhood pride, of leaders who served by doing, not just speaking. And maybe they serve as a quiet reminder that the spirit of citizenship is not dead. It's just been waiting, perhaps, on the other side of the world to remind us what it looks like. Burkina Faso didn't wait for the world to save it. It didn't draft a 10-year plan, apply for foreign grants, or host summits with donor nations. It picked up a broom. What began as a call to clean became a declaration of dignity. What started with dust became a rediscovery of purpose. But let's be clear, this was not just a feel-good story about a small country doing something nice. It was and still is a quiet challenge to the way we think about change. Because if a nation that has suffered so much terrorism, poverty, drought, political instability can rise with nothing more than unity and willpower, what excuse do the rest of us have? And what happens when the rest of Africa starts looking at Burkina Faso not as a struggling sibling but as a model? What happens when people in Lagos, Nairobi, or Detroit say, if they can do it with their bare hands, so can we? That's the quiet power of this movement. It doesn't ask for applause. It asks for reflection. So wherever you are, maybe in a small town in Indiana, a quiet neighborhood in Georgia, or a big city on the East Coast, ask yourself, what is one thing I've been waiting for someone else to fix? What if it's not their job anymore? What if it's mine? Because the people of Burkina Faso have shown us something timeless. Change doesn't always need a revolution. Sometimes it just needs responsibility. If this story moved you, please like this video. Share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of ordinary people. And subscribe if you think the world needs more stories of action, not excuses. At Heroic Fable, we honor the real heroes, those who don't wait for headlines. They act, they build, and sometimes they carry brooms.